Okay, I think we'll kick off, and anybody can, the others can join in as we move along. So listen, great to have you all with us this morning, and what is a gorgeous morning in Cork. I hope it's similar wherever you're based, and it's a Friday as well, which helps. So look, it's great to have the next in our Sustainable Cork program webinar series, and today focusing on a really interesting, I suppose, evolving and exciting topic of electric mobility and how that might redefine our city. And we have an expert panel of speakers who will be introduced shortly, and an outstanding facilitator as well in Stefan Koch from UCC and the Transport Mobility Forum here in Cork as well. And I'll hand over to Stefan very soon. As always, thanks to our supporters and sponsors of our Sustainable Cork programme, Cork Chamber Skillnet, Gas Networks Ireland and Matheson. And it's fantastic to have representatives of all three joining us here as well today. So a little bit of housekeeping as always, just to ensure that you stay on mute. And we'll get to Q&A a little bit later on as well, and put those questions in the chat box as we go along. And also you can choose your viewing, either be it gallery or speaker view there in the top of your screen as well. And as you would have seen coming in, we're recording the event just for our own records. Look, as many of you know, because you're regular joiners on this seminar series, we began the Sustainable Cork programme back in the early phases of COVID, I suppose, to start a conversation around sustainability. And I suppose it's evolved then over the last couple of years to become a real, I think, strong discussion forum and learning forum across a whole range of areas, and transport and sustainable transport being a particular one. And look, it's a really interesting time, I think, in Cork. I think we're making lots of progress. We also have lots of, I suppose, ups and downs and bumps on that road as well. And obviously we have the CMATS, Cork Metropolitan Area Transport Strategy, as a key driver and enabler of that. And I suspect as that strategy was being put in place, an awful lot of what we're going to talk about today wasn't even considered, and certainly wasn't part of the thought process around that particular plan. So that maybe that'll come up. And obviously we have some major aspects of that plan, probably particularly Bus Connects, which is getting, I suppose, going through a consultation phase at the moment, a really important consultation phase. And obviously there's lots of debate taking place around all of that. And look, it's good to have those differing views, but I think it's really important as well that that consultation process is allowed run its course, that NTA can engage with those who have perspectives, be they positive or negative, around the plans that are in place. And I'm sure working collectively we'll get to a very positive outcome across that particular plan. It's also great today that we're at the start of European Mobility Week, so a perfect occasion, I think, to have this conversation. So look, it's great to have you with us. I'm really looking forward to learning a lot on this particular call today. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Stefan, who's the Commuter Plan Manager at UCC, and he's also the chair and the founder member of Cork's Transport and Mobility Forum. So Stefan, over to you.
Thanks a million, Connor, and hello to everybody from my side as well. Connor just mentioned Bus Connects, which is in the public debate right now as we speak, in this coming weeks, with the consultation, first round of consultation finishing soon. And I had a quick phone conversation with a journalist the other day here, and she was wondering, yes, this is all good and nice. If I should, instead of taking the car into town, I should take the bus, but I still have about a 15-minute access walk to the bus. And there needs to be something that is more kind of covering the entire community than a classical bus route would do that. Yes, there is definitely a valid point to it. And I also read an interview on the same topic with the CEO of Hamburg Hochbahn, the second largest German city transport operator. And And he said, if we want to really achieve a sustainable transition of our mobility processes, we must go beyond the classical train and bus operations. So those two elements alone won't be able to do the job. So there needs to be flexible on-demand services. He was talking about autonomous vehicles, autonomous minibuses, getting onto our roads within the next 10 years or so. So there is lots actually in between the classic bus and the taxi or the privately owned car. There's a whole world opening. However, there is very little, as Connor also just briefly mentioned, of this kind of world in the CMATS document, in the Cork Metropolitan Area Transport Strategy. Bits of it are in there, but there is far more potential. So this is an excellent opportunity today to learn on how experts in the field are envisaging the future, are having a look on potential markets of mobility services. And without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, which is Dr. Andreas Nienhaus. He's a partner in Oliver Wyman Automotive and Manufacturing Practice, based in their Frankfurt office in Germany. And he has been involved in numerous projects of the automotive and mobility segment with a strong focus on growth strategies and sales and commercial excellence. So Andreas, over to you. The floor is yours. Bitte schön.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Hello, everybody from my side as well. I will start sharing my slides immediately to kick off the discussion. Maybe a few words up front, as already been said. Andreas Nienhaus, I'm a partner in our automotive manufacturing practice, focusing primarily on automotive and mobility. And the content I'm going to present right now has been part of the Oliver Wyman Mobility Forums effort. So Oliver Wyman is a classic strategy consulting firm, a global firm focusing on strategy consultancy. But we have a Oliver Wyman Forum, which is our global think tank around certain topics. And I'm lucky enough to lead the Oliver Wyman Mobility Forum, where we spend a bit more time and effort than we usually do in our project work to understand how mobility develops and evolves over time, how people get from A to B, how people want to get from A to B, or just connect A and B. So without further ado, let me just share my screen and jump right into it. As I said, I think the introduction has been done. The study that I'm going to show now has been a collaborative effort with the University of Berkeley. Over the last 1.5 years, I've been working very closely together with Professor Alex Bayen, who is heading the Institute of Transportation at the University of Berkeley, and obviously a large team that has been involved either from Oliver Wyman's side or Berkeley side to make this happen. Just to provide a bit of context what the Oliver Wyman Forum does, in addition to the strategy work that Oliver Wyman as a consultancy does, we are trying to create a platform that connects different players in the field of mobility to really get the thinking and the development on new mobility going, to talk about mobility transformation. So we work not only with universities, we work very closely with the World Economic Forum, for instance, with the World Bank, and trying to connect the dots here and have more depth in the studies on how different trends, how different technologies in this space evolve. But without further ado, let me jump into the content itself. So the findings I want to talk about today are circling around what are future mobility value pools. So over, as I said, the last 18 months in a larger team, we had a closer look on 13 mobility services across the 3 major regions of this world, and investigating a time frame up till 2030. We looked at it on a yearly basis, and we looked at each individual service on a standalone basis, developing a rather large quantitative model in the background on really understanding what drives the development of mobility services, where will future value pools emerge, how do future value pools look like, what's the growth from a quantitative perspective, but also from a qualitative implication perspective, what makes this happen, how do they interact with each other, sorry for that, and basically how to make sense of the development of new mobility in this state of time right now. So the good thing that we found out as a top line is basically mobility services. These new mobility services, they are growing, and they're growing fast, and they're growing faster than traditional mobility services. So this already indicates that we are in the middle of a mobility transformation. Luckily, people to some extent get away from using the traditional personally owned car and really try out or use new mobility services, new mobility modes. And the growth rate over the next years is quite significant, and the value bucket behind it also. And now, obviously, the important question is, where does it come from? What to look out for, and are people actually just traveling more, spending more money, or is the technology advancing so that more people can get from A to B, and questions like that. So let me take the next 8 minutes I think I have on my clock to jump into that. And the first dimension I want to look at is the regional dimension. So as I said, we looked at the three main areas around the world, like North America, Europe, and Asia. And while all three areas exhibit roughly similar growth rates, it's quite interesting to see where they come from and what makes this growth, right? So on the one side, it's obvious Asia is the largest, by far the largest region when it comes to mobility value pools. But they are, this mobility value pool in Asia is made up completely differently than for instance, in North America and Europe. While in North America, we have a very high penetration of digital services and digital customers, or digitally enabled customers and consumers. This is the case in large metropolitan areas in Asia, but the vast majority of mobility users in Asia either don't have access or not, or are just not as digital yet when it comes to mobility services. On the other side, in North America, traditionally, we have a very high ownership of individual mobility, especially personal cars. And we see in our studies and also in surveys that we conduct on a regular basis that this is a very hard nut to crack. And this favor of personal mobility that circles around the personal car has some stickiness, to formulate that, especially in North America. When we look at what's driving growth, especially in this region, it's not just the invention of a completely new set of mobility, is particularly driven by enabling mobility services. And one example we have here is smart parking services. So routing and payment of everything that's connected to parking, especially when you have a high penetration of personally owned vehicles. You have not only in North America, but also in Europe, a very high degree of urban traffic that is circling around parking, either finding a parking spot, driving towards a parking spot, coming from the parking spot to the actual destination, and so on. That makes up to 30% of a city's traffic processes, mobilities around parking. And making this parking digital and to some extent smart not only reduces traffic, but also obviously implies a huge potential for attractive services that can be developed around them. When we look at Europe, we see that we have been hit very hard, and harder than other regions when it comes to restriction in mobility. We, especially public transport, we still haven't recovered from that in most of European metropolitan areas. And we also saw a very interesting shift in the role regulators or the government plays when it comes to mobility. In the past, we had very passive mobility management within metropolitan areas. And then all of a sudden within the pandemic, it shifted towards regulating if people are even allowed to leave the house, right? So what we see now when we talk to regulators, and we have an expert on this panel who can elaborate on that, but when we talk to different cities, we see that they will not go back to a pre-pandemic state of being completely passive when it comes to regulating the mobility ecosystem within their city or metropolitan areas. They will try to steer and manage mobility services in a more active way, which obviously has implications on the providers themselves. Well, now looking at what are the different modes and services that drive growth within these different regions, it's very interesting to see that we have in part completely different drivers across the world. And just giving you this example of kick scooters, especially in Europe and in the States, kick scooters are not only exhibiting significant growth, but they are also obviously in the public debate, right? Too many scooters across the cities, annoying people who want to just walk the sidewalk and so on. So there's a public debate about kick scooters, and they are grabbing market share and exhibiting significant growth. In Asia, that's not the case. They are hardly existing in most metropolitan areas. The mobility consumption that is made up by kick scooters in North America and Europe is for decades now in firm hands by bikes and bike sharing in Asia. So we see that we cannot just use one mobility service and assume that is equally growing or equally important across region. That's obviously not the case. And in some instances, that's even not existing on the one side of the world, while it's an important part of the mobility ecosystem in another part of the world. In all these modes you see here are basically enabled by the penetration of digital services, by the digital maturity of not only the users themselves, but also the infrastructure, which plays a very important role. So another question that we looked at is one driver that is influencing the way we get from A to B is obviously the impact on the environment. So the sustainability angle is something that is extremely important when discussing mobility modes. And we tried to map the individual growth of mobility services with their impact on sustainability. So we created some sort of sustainability indicator where we try to measure their impact. And the positive notion is that, as you can see in this analysis, that the modes that are growing the fastest most of the time have a positive impact on the status quo of the mobility ecosystem. So we see greener modes growing faster than traditional modes. This, of course, needs to be enabled. So one very important underlying enabler is for instance, the charging infrastructure within the regions, which is yet to be established to an extent that this can really happen until 2030. But still we see that, and we see this by consumers as well, that the demand for these services is also driven by sustainability aspects. Not only when we look, for instance, at classic EV purchasing behavior, it's obviously largely driven by subsidies as well, but increasingly so around the globe by the sustainability impact as well. But this is obviously just an indication, because it comes down to how are these different services integrated into a wider mobility ecosystem, because they all have to function together. Again, coming back to the example of scooter sharing, it's a fantastic mode and it's a fantastic standalone mode when it comes to sustainability, but we need to make sure, of course, that it's not substituting walking or public transport, but that it's enabling other efficient and sustainable modes of transportation.
Yes, 2 more minutes, please.
So we did this exercise, and it's of course an indication, but we really try to map out where does the growth come from and where does it go to, and look at the cannibalization of traditional transport modes. And one important finding is, while we have traditional transport modes that remain attractive and remain important in the overall mobility ecosystem, like taxis, they do have to reinvent themselves, right? While a lot of people still use the classical taxi, they do so via a platform, via digital end-to-end digitized booking and payment process. So if you want to remain a relevant player in the mobility ecosystem, you need to adapt and especially be able to, on the one hand, digitize your service, and in being able to integrate your service either into a wider platform or creating the platform itself, which is obviously harder to do. And the story of cannibalization and integrating different services is extremely important when you look at a metropolitan area per se, because that can be something that can be managed, or at least in part steered by the regulator, by the overall city, to make sure that we don't have cannibalization going in the wrong way, and overall move towards a more efficient, more sustainable, and more affordable mobility. I hope I'm now pinpointing the 12 minutes and giving over to you, Stefan, and then looking forward to the questions. I already saw some in the chat. I think there's probably Q&A then.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andreas, for this very valuable insights, and especially the aspect of cannibalization. Do we cannibalizing the modes we want to cannibalize, or the ones we don't want to cannibalize? Maybe we can come back later to that question in the discussion, because there's very often big debate around, especially e-scooters, not actually replacing what people hope that they would replace. But now we're getting into basically the real life realm, from a more kind of scientific analytic presentation from Andreas to what is happening really on the ground. And for this presentation, I'd like to welcome Eduardo Green. He's working for the City of Amsterdam, a local authority, as a service designer and innovation manager, in charge for everything that goes basically the step beyond classic public transport or individual transport. So it is everything to do with smart mobility for the City of Amsterdam, especially designing data-driven strategic experiments and innovation in helping to achieve the City of Amsterdam's mobility goals. Something Amsterdam we're always looking over to when the discussion is about cycling infrastructure in Cork. Yeah, we know Amsterdam, the bikes, the trams, all the rest of it. But there is much more, the rest of it, which definitely isn't the rest. So everything beyond that, we'd like to get a little bit more insight now from Eduardo. The floor is yours, alsjeblieft.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Yes, Eduardo Green from the City of Amsterdam, working within the Urban Innovation team. Just put my presenter mode here. The Urban Innovation team started around about 6 odd years ago and consists of 3 people, and we are now around about 300 people covering a range of different policy areas, and under which we also have the Smart Mobility team, consisting of around about 25 people. And we are guided by these 3 goals: that all Amsterdammers, her visitors and her goods will travel cleaner and smarter, that Amsterdam is influential in the digital mobility system, and that Amsterdam is the smart mobility system #1. Now, I absolutely hate that last goal. I don't think it's an objective nor a goal, and I fight with my managers about it all the time. On the contrary, we are a public institution. We are not in a competition, and we do our utmost best to work with other cities to achieve our common objectives. But I always like to start with this picture, because what you see here is the 1939 World Fair in New York City, an exhibition called Futurama. And this man, his name is Norman Bell Geddes. And what they're doing here is quite literally designing cities to be more car-centric. The automobile is becoming ever more accessible, they're becoming cheaper, more affordable. And they have this problem, of course, that cities are not really designed for cars. So they are creating and redesigning cities for cars. And it's often regarded as the birthplace of such terms as suburbia, because people didn't need to live close to city centers anymore, and the motorway or the freeway. And almost ironically, what we're doing now is the very opposite. We're trying very hard to get the cars and the lorries out of our cities. We intend to be a 100% emission-free city by 2030. And what you can see in this planning is that by the end of 2025, we expect that every single modality, including boats and all logistics and taxis, should be emission-free. Only personally owned vehicles will be allowed to be emission-emitting vehicles up until 2030. And some of the ways in which we're doing that is to try and influence the system based on city values. And if you think about it, a city has not an awful lot of ways in which to be able to influence or steer its mobility system. We use signs, we use road markings, we use flashing lights, we have too many signs. And what we're trying to do is to be able to influence and steer our mobility system and influence our public space using digital means and digital channels. So such things as navigation systems, logistics planning tools, digital displays, mobile phones. We want to be able to influence and steer this, but based on city values. And city values, of course, are accessibility, livability, safety, sustainability, inclusivity. I call them the IDIs, and this is how we're trying to move and drive our mobility system forward. And one such example of this is with logistics. Of course, if we don't have logistics, we don't have a city. But Amsterdam's infrastructure, our canal walls and our bridges designed many hundreds of years ago were never designed to take the kinds of loads that they're being subjected to today. And so we would like to be able to influence and steer logistics, for example, based on their weight limits in real time and say, you're too heavy to come into this area, so therefore you are provided another route, or that you're not compliant with our emissions, and maybe even using things like intelligent access where we cut the power of a truck and we can engage an electric motor so it does the last mile. We conducted experiments, or we were trying to conduct experiments using autonomous shuttles. We spent 2 years during Corona time where we were not able to conduct the pilots because we could not keep the social distancing inside the vehicle, the passengers safe. And after 2 years, we decided to pull the plug on the project, but not without its learnings. We realized that there's quite a way to go in terms of legislation. This would have been done as a viable form of public transport, and the first time we have autonomous vehicles going onto Amsterdam's roads, on public roads, and in collaboration with our GVB, our transport concession holder. And we realized that Amsterdam, with its sort of, up to 50 million tourists a year, international as well as domestic, we do need more people movers rather than small vehicles. But there's still use cases, for example, where you can see my cursor, we're building a whole new neighborhood, which we call Harbour City, 80,000 new homes. And these kinds of services might be able to work to create kind of mobility services inside of the actual neighborhood itself, rather than connector services. We do have also a mobility as a service solution, not without its challenges, I might add. It does have all the modalities that you see over here, but there have been some challenges in terms of user adoption and of course in terms of payment, which tends to be a little bit of the problem always with mobility as a service solutions. But we are evolving it and taking that forward. During Corona time, we also developed an app, and this app helped people to stay socially distanced. So we took the 26 busiest parts of the city and provided them these kinds of traffic light warnings about the amount of people that are there to help them to stay socially distanced, and also with prediction models about when it would be quieter and better for them to be able to go out into the streets. This, of course, is not necessarily relevant anymore. So we're now looking to develop this towards a tourist-facing app to help them have a better experience when visiting the city and avoiding those crowds. And this was already mentioned by Andreas. We do have a team that is only looking at facilitating and anticipating new mobility concepts, because these things are moving faster than what we can regulate them or understand them and learn about them. There's new models coming onto the market all the time. And so anticipation is a big part of it. We are also experimenting with these kinds of autonomous boats, which has a number of use cases, from household waste collection to people movers, if you will. And also just to highlight here that we do work very closely with the European Union and other institutions. We do have a program that focuses entirely on startup and scale up and helping those businesses and attracting them to Amsterdam. And we work very closely with our football arena as well on crowd management innovations. The hubs, we have a number of reclaimed parking spaces where we've created locations for these shared modalities where we can bring together clusters of these scooters, e-cars, and we put the charging infrastructure in place if we need be. We want to have these things at neighborhood level. We have 18 of them at the moment, and we intend to have 30 of them by next year. And I've got a little video here just to show you what a sort of a street transformation would look like. And in this video, you will see that we also have what we call cars as a guest, which means that we've changed the prioritization of the street, where cars and pedestrians are prioritized first. And whoops, that was not the intention. How do I play? Where cars and pedestrians are prioritized first, and then cars are last in the prioritization. So it's about, of course, removing cars from the streets and then creating more places for leisure, more places where kids can enjoy and yeah, playgrounds and that sort of thing. And then you'll also see as well, as it goes forward, that we have concepts here in terms of what our mobility hubs could look like, which you see coming up here. And within that as well, we can have owned assets, if you will, by the municipality that is for everybody in the community to share. And it's not to say that we per se ban the car altogether, but we want to be able to change the behaviors of people to start using these shared services much more than having personally owned vehicles. So these are the different types of hubs. The street level hub I've already explained. The city to neighborhood hubs is where we take fixed line transport that will engage in towards flexible services or active modes. And of course, we have the regional services that will perhaps engage to more flexible services or fixed line transport as well. And one such example of a hub is what we call the fuel station of the future. And this has gone out to tender. It has already been awarded, where we've taken an existing petrol station and we've asked them to go and develop collectively this fuel station of the future, which of course comprises everything except for combustible fuels. And this would also act, if you will, as a sort of a city interchange hub as well. I don't know why they decided that Wally should be there, but we are going to build this in the coming years. And then something that's a little bit close to my heart, which is about bicycles and bicycle technology going faster and faster. We put these kinds of electric engines onto bicycles and we still call them bicycles when they're not. They are actually motorcycles, let's be completely honest. And because the technology is allowing things to go faster and faster, it does pose safety hazards. So what I'm working on is to be able to influence and send semiotic warnings or nudges towards the bike's digital environment to be able to encourage people to slow down. I think it's also important to mention that what we see is that industry is increasingly taking up these kinds of roles, where cycling was once upon a time the domain of really just the citizen and also to a lesser extent the tourist. But as we push forward with our emission reduction goals, we see that industry is not sitting idle either. We're moving much more towards this platform economy, and we are creating these bicycles, these vehicles to fulfill these roles of cars and lorries as they become more intrusive in our city. And so industry is going to start taking up a lot more space in our cities going forward, which we need to be aware of. And these are all powered by batteries, of course, so they are powerful instruments. And finally, 80% of all commuters in Amsterdam do it by bicycle or by public transport. It's a very luxury problem. But this is what I mean a little bit when we talk about having cars as a guest streets. We have a number of them already in Amsterdam, and I do believe that Amsterdam will be the first full cycling city by 2030. And what that means is that it's a maximum 30-kilometer speed limit. We change the color to demonstrate that it's a red road, and therefore cyclists are have the priority. The cars are not allowed to drive any faster than the cyclists. We've also got our first bicycle highways where they're allowed to go 40, 45 kilometers an hour. These are intercity connections for bicycles. And just also to point out as well that it doesn't really matter about your age. Everybody does love cycling in Amsterdam. And so when we started off this presentation talking about car-centric cities, my main thing that I'm working on is about how we design people-centric cities, and that's the main objective that we have going forward. That was just a snapshot of some of the things that we're working on behalf of myself and everyone from the City of Amsterdam. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Eduardo. Bang on time, to be honest, and very interesting presentation. Lots of food for thought for us. And the one thing that stuck with me is the autonomous vehicles in your new Harbour City neighborhood. I mean, this must sound familiar to most of the audience here. We have our docklands to be developed here in Cork along the River Lee, and we're basically in the same boat. And hopefully we might also sit in the same autonomous people mover at some stage. So lots of food for thought to come back in the discussion, back to them. But before the Q&A and the discussion, I'd like to introduce our third presenter. It's Russell Vickers, CEO of Future Mobility Campus Ireland, a non-for-profit organization based in the Shannon area, which is providing a test bed for everything related to electric, autonomous, and connected vehicles. And so this is basically the direct step over now in terms of autonomous minibuses. So Connor, you might tell us a bit more about all of that. Your background is in automotive engineering with Jaguar and Land Rover, and also focusing here in your previous work on generating new revenue streams, new offers, new business cases for the automotive industry, before having moved now to creating the test bed for the for autonomous and digitally connected vehicles. Tell us more about it. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you today. Yeah, see my slides. So yeah, as Stefan said, I'm the CEO of Future Mobility Campus Ireland. We are a not-for-profit organisation that's based out of Shannon. We're funded primarily by Enterprise Ireland and Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, as the new name is. And our focus is mostly around creating a living test lab for connected autonomous vehicles. We also look at air mobility and smart city infrastructure. We're mostly focused on industry and research and development on creating solutions for that. And that's kind of where my background started from. So we're here to enable Indigenous Irish companies as well as multinationals as they develop products for both, not just for the Ireland region or Europe, but kind of for a further afield as well. So yeah, as I said, we're based in Shannon. So, you know, from our point of view, I think it was discussed quite a lot already, but, you know, there's kind of four fundamental forces that are happening: autonomy, connected vehicles, electric vehicles, and the shared mobility. And you know, you need for those things to succeed, which is a huge sea change, especially in the automotive industry. You know, you need to figure out the standards, the infrastructure, and then create a collaborative ecosystem, because again, no one company can solve any of these problems by themselves. So from our point of view, FMCI is we see ourselves as an enabling platform for that. We're mostly funded to build infrastructure, and then different companies and research institutes can build products on top of that infrastructure. We're based in the Shannon Free Zone. So the Shannon Free Zone has existed since the 1950s, kind of built as the airport grew up. And we're essentially using that business park as our living lab, where we're able to put the infrastructure on the roads, and we can kind of change that as we need to, you know, to evaluate new types of technologies. So a big part of, we're 80% funded by the government, and then the other 20% is kind of raised from our partners. And, you know, surprisingly, I suppose, like when I joined Jaguar Land Rover in 2017, I wasn't really aware of the size of the ecosystem that exists in Ireland. And there's a lot of, from a transportation point of view, especially in automotive, these companies are trying to become tech companies, essentially. It's much more around software development and those type of data management skills than it is around, you know, mechanical engineering and creating hardware. So from that point of view, it really plays into Ireland's wheelhouse, and we have a lot of partner companies then that have been supporting us, both local authorities, industry partners, and also some of the SFI funded bodies in Ireland, as well as Shannon Group, or Shannon Airport Group as they're now called, and you know, we heavily leverage the infrastructure that they have. So in terms of what am I actually talking about? Well, this video here will just kind of give you an overview of what we've built. We just completed the project or the build around a couple of months ago. So this was kind of a precursor to that build. You can see the area. This is the Shannon Free Zone. This is what we mark as our smart city. We own a lot of the fiber and ducting in this area. We can basically add that equipment. We have a dedicated testing area and also an advanced area mobility hub. So I'll just on the volume too loud. Reduce that a little bit. But essentially, so the first part of what we have is we've got a building, and that's kind of the hub. This is a multi-tenant facility. So we work with startups, we work with big companies, and essentially they come here, whether it's for a day, a week, a month, a year, whatever, to leverage the infrastructure. So we have, you know, a typical kind of city planner control room, which manages our infrastructure. We also then have a shared lab for startups to build, you know, to test and develop their hardware and software. And then at the back of the building, then we have different work bays. So it's quite common for these type of test beds to have multi-tenants where you've got maybe different OEMs or different companies in there testing their products, and that's the way we've developed what we have here. So we have office space that we can rent out to different customers, and then we've got the workshop bays. We also have 2 mule vehicles that have been actually kindly donated from Jaguar Land Rover, and they're our connected autonomous vehicles. So they're the type of vehicle that you see, maybe like a Waymo vehicle with all the sensors on top, the sensors and LiDAR. And those vehicles are used by startups, and we're working with one particularly promising radar company that basically take their product and integrate it onto those vehicles for testing. So that's the building. And then we've got 2 other areas where we also have, where we're looking, I can't remember if we go to we go to the Air Mobility Hub. So I think once we got our initial tranche of funding, we really started to look at air mobility as well. Primary reason for us was we've got a major international airport right beside us, and it's, you know, underutilized, and we wanted to, a lot of the technologies that are being advanced in for road autonomy are also being used in air autonomy. So that's an area that we're looking at. We built this initially. This is all in place now. It's to look at things like drones and how you manage the traffic between you know, manned traffic and unmanned. But the idea for us is we expand that to air taxis. We also have this dedicated testing area, and this was developed in conjunction with the companies like the likes of Jaguar Land Rover, Vallejo. Again, this is for low-speed maneuvering. So a lot of the low-speed maneuvering systems on vehicles are guided by cameras, and basically the cameras have to be able to detect all the different types of parking spots. We also expanded that area then to cover micromobility, because we started to realize, as was discussed earlier, you know, it's kind of, there's not a lot of regulation in this area. In Ireland, it's still not, it's not legal to put these vehicles on the road yet. So we want to look at, in terms of safety systems, there's no standards really in terms of safety, how these vehicles are managed, and that's something that we're proposing to use that area for. Generally, you know, we don't stop there. We see Ireland as a test bed, and we're working in conjunction with Transport Infrastructure Ireland, and they're working on a project to create 450 kilometers of connected highway. So that's an EU-backed project, and essentially that testing area, is the way we see it, will then allow for us to plug into that infrastructure. So you start with the training wheels at FMCI, and then you can expand further afield. These type of use cases on connected highway are things around vehicle-to-vehicle messaging, you know, where the vehicles can communicate to each other from a safety point of view, as well as into the future, you can look at things like truck platooning as this kind of gets built out. So from an EU point of view, what we're doing here in Ireland is quite unique in terms of the scale of what's been planned for this. I spoke also about FMCI, or about the air mobility side of that, and that's something that we're getting a lot of momentum with. So, you know, this is potentially a huge market when you look at drones and air taxis, and basically we want to demonstrate that in a live airport environment, understanding how we manage all that traffic. So we've created Ireland's first UAV testing area, vertiport facility, and we're going to build that out as the legislation regulations start to really get pushed out from the EU side. A big piece of it is around the unmanned traffic management framework. So how do you manage thousands of new nodes on the network that are now buzzing around the skies, and how do you make sure that you can still operate the air services that exist today without any safety concerns? So that's a big area that we're looking at. And obviously, from our point of view, we want to do this in controlled airspace. So we've been working with the Irish Aviation Authority, Shannon Air Traffic Control, and we've already done some beyond visual line of sight flights with FedEx, where we flew from Shannon Airport over to Foynes Port, completely autonomously. The vehicle, you just press go on the drone, and it flew by itself and flew over and delivered a package to kind of prove out some of these use cases. More around, for us, it's not about just proving out the ability of a drone to take a box. It's about the ability of how that works in with the whole ecosystem. So as I said, we've been making good progress in this, and we've just recently been awarded an EU Horizon Fund, or a CESAR fund, with Collins Aerospace, and the Collins team are actually are mostly based out of Cork from the R&D side, and that's to actually put some infrastructure in. So this is a 3-year pilot project, and we're going to put extensive infrastructure in terms of radars and things like that, to be able to manage all of that traffic. So we're looking at how we manage traffic that's the standard traffic that Shannon Air Traffic Control have to deal with today, but then all of these new nodes on the network. And obviously, you don't want to flood a standard air traffic control system with like thousands of little drones that are at little risk and are flying, maybe only 120 feet in the air. So then you need to figure out how you manage all that, and that's where these traffic management systems come into play. So again, for us, we mostly focus on kind of the products and trying to get stuff into industry. We work a lot with the Department of Transport, though, it must be said. We have similar. We're pushing for legislation on autonomous vehicles. Again, like some of the other European jurisdictions, we can't test on the roads at the moment, but that's something that's actually going through the Oireachtas at the moment. We played a part in that, and we'll continue to do that. For us, we're like, this is kind of where I start to get really excited when you start to think around air taxis. I mean, this has kind of been marketed across the globe, I suppose, that pinging from suburb to somewhere like in Singapore, these major metropolises. But for somewhere like Ireland, especially on the West Coast, and I'm including everyone in Cork on this, but we're kind of pretty infrastructure poor on this side. We don't have the major train lines, the major motorways. It can actually take a long time to get from a relatively short distance of time. Look, it takes us, the 80 kilometers of road that it is from Limerick to Cork takes well over 2 hours at the moment. And we know there's solutions in play for that. But the wider case of it is we really see things like sustainable air taxis or electric air taxis being able to fill in gaps for a lot of this. So it's something that, we're really excited about, and we're really pushing, we're discussing how we can actually, try and make these services a reality as we move forward. Again, these are still a few years off, and they're still a few years off appearing in Ireland, but we want to actually kind of push that whole ecosystem, because there's such a strong aviation industry in Ireland anyway, and this is kind of the next side of that. So, this is just kind of one last video that I have. We're just, this is kind of the modest, this is the vertiport that we have in place at the moment. So again, we use some of these vehicles for testing of different sensors, relocation systems. This is just outside the airport boundary, but this is something that we're looking to expand in the next coming years and months as we move forward to really understand these systems. So I think that's kind of all I have. I kind of wanted to give you a flavor of everything that we have. We're a very open, collaborative group. We're happy to talk to anyone that's interested in this space from an Irish or beyond context. And I hope that gives you a good flavor of what we have. So, and you're always welcome to pop by as well, by the way.
Thanks very much, Russell. Talk about flavor was a really strong flavor, really impressive. And what I took away from here is, if anybody comes up with a potentially wild idea, you give them the space to try it out, to get a prototype, to get it on the road or up into the air and see how it can perform in real life. So a little bit of sci-fi at the end, but really impressive, and good to know that something like this is around in Ireland. So thank you very much, all the three speakers. We are just only a few minutes over time now, but just about to start with our Q&A session. I have 2 or 3 questions that already came in. I'm just gonna go through them, and maybe later on, or now I invite everybody, if they have a question, to put it into the chat. We can't guarantee that we get to all of the questions. I will try to group a little bit And but nonetheless, we hope we have another just shy of half an hour time for Q&As. Talk about Q&As. There was the first question came in after Andreas' presentation, wondering about the different age profiles, about acceptance or potential uptake of these services according to different age profiles. Has there been any distinction been made in your market research that would relate to either one age group or the other, or I'd say different walks of life, different life circumstances? Andreas, please.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very important dimension in future mobility or mobility services, and I think there are two answers to this question. On the one side, all these new mobility services and technological advancements, they have the chance of making mobility accessible to groups of our society that have not had the chance to use it to an extent as they probably would like to have. So not only from a financial point of view, but also from a capabilities point of view. So creating equity and using mobility as a chance to enhance the possibilities for the entire society to get from A to B, that's extremely important, especially when looking at the downside that's potentially out there as well, to make certain mobility services just another playing field for the rich, in quotation marks, right? So it's really important that we set these things up in a way that it's really leveraging the opportunities for society as such, and not just for view, especially. And now coming back to the question, the needs and also the demands of different parts of our society are completely different. Right? It can be that some mobility services are hyped but are completely irrelevant for certain parts of our society, and we need to keep that in mind. And also the accessibility for especially intermodal services need to account for that. Some portions of our society are not able to just freely switch from one mode to the other while getting from A to B, right? And just giving you the example of the mobility platform or the mobility coordination app from Den Haag, they ask you if you have any disabilities, and they incorporate that in their plan if there are a lot of stairs or anything involved in the intermodal offering that they have. And it's extremely important, and not only from a capability point of view, not only from a financial point of view, but also from what people really want, right? We need to account for the heterogeneity in that.
Thank you, Andreas. And some comment that I might add from my anecdotal experience: take e-scooters and take electric bikes. E-scooters, they're potentially more for an age group up to, let's say, around the early 50s or something. I can't see kind of elderly people actually using e-scooters to a larger extent. Whereas on the other hand, the advent of electric bicycles, we hear from one dealer locally here that it has opened up cycling to a complete new demographic. You were mentioning physical capabilities, was opening up cycling to people far beyond the usual typical cycling age into their 60s and even 70s, and open up basically this entire experience to an older demographic. Or locally, Cork is very hilly. As soon as you leave the River Lee Valley, especially to the north side, where somebody who's not really fully fit as a trainer would struggle to cycle up, but with an electric bike, it works really well, and it opens up not only for different demographics, but also for different local populations in terms of topography. So very interesting point. And yes, of course, the ultimate goal should be to provide an alternative to the private car to basically all walks of life with all the different needs. Another question, as we're talking about all the digital modeling, Eduardo, question for you from the floor. It is probably not enough to use classical 2D or 3D digital mapping. What kind of a geospatial database would you use in Amsterdam for all your services, locating vehicles, making interventions here or there, depending on location, etc.? What's your database you're working on?
Now, a very difficult question for me to answer because I'm utterly technologically challenged. I'm a social scientist in every regard. I do know that when we talk about our rowboats, they're using things like LiDAR, But in terms of the actual mapping itself, I can't really honestly tell you. It's really up to the providers that we work with that have been doing that. However, I can say that it's been very important for us to be able to almost create, if you will, this digital twin of the city. Because when we talk about this notion of being able to send dynamic policies or digital rules or being able to influence the public space in real time, we do need to have that almost at street level. And well, it is at street level that we need to have it. But yes, that doesn't really necessarily answer the question, but we have got what we call the national access point or the national database for traffic management. And within that, we have a centralized full location with our traffic management and road rules. And that is what is allowing us to be able to be dynamic in the way in which we can communicate these different rules, to be able to influence the mobility system more in real time. But I'm very sorry, I can't really answer the question about what kind of technology is being used.
Okay, I assume, I don't know who that question came from. Maybe via the chamber there would be kind of the option of having a contact link to you in case you
I can find out.
Direct people. Super. It's good to know that you are not kind of a solely tech background person, but the social scientist, because from what I learned from my university years, being a transport engineer, engineering would only take you so far. It is also the psychology and sociology factor and acceptance factor that needs to figure into that, because I'd say at least half of the decisions or half the reason we take decisions for mobility modes, it is not rational, it is not technically based, it is emotion, it is social values, it is behavioral sciences. So very good to see that there is a disciplinary crossover.
Just to very quickly add to it, I mean, cities cannot do innovation in isolation, right? We need to have the help of external partners. And of course, that then, of course, requires also the people who have got the technical knowledge, the engineers, etc., to be able to bring these kinds of concepts and services to life. We can come up with the ideas to an extent, but we can't, we struggle, of course, on the delivery part, the scaling.
Yeah. All right. Talking about acceptance, at the moment, as I said at the start, we have the big discussion locally going on here about Bus Connects. It is the big investment program for largely improving or basically reinventing Cork's public transport system, with bus corridors being redesigned, physically redesigned to provide bus priority. And there is lots of, let's say, challenging situations as it comes to local acceptance. There will be change outside people's doorsteps. What you were presenting, Eduardo, is really kind of a change in offers, but also if you're intervening into people's behavior, as I understand, this is kind of also a question, would that be accepted by people? So maybe first a question to you, Eduardo. How do you deal on the acceptance front? And I also just remember this video that you show on completely transforming the street that would in some neighborhoods cause uproar. I don't know what the case was in Amsterdam. And maybe also then, Andreas, to you, is there any kind of research gone into what demographic would, to what extent, accept in what type of new mobility service? So, but maybe first over to you, Eduardo.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, everything that we do in mobility, of course, is pretty much behavioral based. You know, if we want to be able to shift people away from personally owned vehicles, shift people away from emission emitting vehicles, then it's going to be about changing behaviors. And of course, that is inherently very, very difficult. But what I have seen is that traditionally cities tend to take the path more towards enforcement. We increase what it costs to park somewhere. We fine people more and more, and we try to use this kind of as a leverage to be able to change those behaviors, which of course doesn't work in any way whatsoever. So we're taking the point of view that we need to be able to be more of a facilitating government rather than a repressive government, if you will, for want of a better word. And so that's why we focus a lot more on this idea of saying the whole entire mobility system is dictated by rules everywhere you go. People can drive completely on autopilot and have the terms completely dictated to them. Well, we want to start bringing that back a little bit and putting responsibility back into people's own hands. And that means then that we are going to encourage them through nudging through advisory warnings, if you will, rather than through enforcement. And it's a real big assumption, of course, that, if we don't have the framework of rules in place, that people won't listen to it. Well, it's quite interesting to see what happened when the rules are broken down and how people interact with that. They become a lot more cautious and a lot more responsive to their fellow road users. They're a lot more receptive to them. And that's a little bit what we're doing. It's almost to say we need to break down all of these signs where we've dictated everything to them and allow them to be, humans.
It is a little bit like the shared space concept by Hans Monderman in the Netherlands about 30 years ago that I hear out of that. Yes, give autonomy back to people and see how they deal with it, how they react to it. Andreas, the second part of the question I put over to you in terms of how would services be accepted in a different way by different people.
Yeah, so I mean, the first part of my answer is basically stating the obvious. So what we see when it comes to the usage and integration of new mobility services and modes into day-to-day behavior is the younger digital tech open group of society that's adopting this with the fastest and is open-minded. But that's obviously stating what we already know. But what we also see is if you introduce a service or a technology within a closed parameter or within a closed area that people are familiar with. So, for instance, on a campus or in a very distinct line of travel, then people outside of this group that are that I just mentioned adapt this new mode, not only out of necessity, but because they feel still being in their safe environment despite having to cope with the new technology. So the combination of being in a safe environment and knowing, okay, if I'm about to use this new technology within the safe environment, it might be okay. This increases adoption rates with groups who are probably not using it in a just open public space from day one. In addition, I can completely just underline what Eduardo says. It's about positive incentivation. It's not about restricting things that are dear and near to me in the status quo.
All right. Safe environment. That gives me a keyword to play the ball over to Russell. Do you have any plans in your kind of lab environment, test bed, to have it open to the public to, for instance, have a first-hand experience of what it means to go into an electric autonomous minibus to shuttle you around kind of a little mock-up city setting in the free zone? Are there any plans from your side on that, or is it feasible legislation-wise already to open it up on a test basis to the public?
Yeah, so the kind of the wider test bed area that we have is falls under like public, just standard Road Traffic Act. But the private area that we have is the area that we can do that. So that's kind of where we expanded that capability to have like a little mini road network where we don't have to worry about legislation. Obviously, safety we do care about, but from that point of view, at least we can get those shuttles. And the same for even like demonstrating to local authorities. We're seeing a lot of interest from micromobility companies in terms of, because they have to, from an Irish context and I presume across Europe, they're dealing with all the different local authorities across Ireland. And it's difficult for the local authorities to know, the products that are being demonstrated or shown, like, how do they cross compare and what's the characteristics that they should look for? So that's kind of the idea that we have with that area, that we can really kind of drive that forward and help put some standardization in terms of that, as well as being able to demonstrate to the public and for the public to kind of figure out, how do they use them? How do they use them safely? And, is there a benefit there or not?
Thank you. That's really good to know that there is such a test bed here in Ireland now, and hopefully there might be the opportunity for, first of all, decision makers, but then also the general public to actually get a flavor of what that feels like in real life. Because at the end of the day, autonomous vehicles, I just mentioned that interview with the Hamburg Hochbahn CEO. He said, we've been through 5 years or so of continuous testing of these autonomous mini shuttles. There was a test in my hometown, Berlin. There were tests in Hamburg. There were tests on university or hospital campuses. Now we're according to him, getting into the stage where we really need to put flesh to the bones, put it out there in the public sphere, have it as another element of the public transport mix, because that's what would be needed to actually solve the last mile problem that will always exist in classic public transport. Another question that came in was, what would you guys recommend for a city like Cork? What would be the most appropriate thing or the most promising thing to try? Is it more buses, e-bikes, e-scooters, car sharing, trams? Now we would have the little difficulty that while Russell might be a bit familiar with Cork, I don't think that Eduardo or Andreas are. So I might rephrase the question a little bit. Taking a 250,000 city, population city, with a large ambitions to expand, with a harbor city, a docklands redevelopment coming on stream, which is now just rejigging its public transport system, mainly based still on traditional buses and trains, and with a prospect of an east-west tram route in about 15, 20 years time. What from your experience would be, let's say, the easiest to implement, the kind of quickly rewarding, low-hanging fruit to complement the classic public transport, to actually make it more ground covering, left and right from the transport routes, make it more accessible, solving the last mile issue, and at the end of the day, not cannibalizing what we don't want to get cannibalized, walking and the cycling, the active travel. Maybe as a final round for the three of you. I don't know who wants to start. Just fire away.
Oh, if I may say, you know, no two cities are the same, of course, and each one is going to have their own kind of unique modality propositions and more dominant modalities than the other. But what I always say is that when you have got lots of people who are going in the same direction, fixed line public transport still remains the best modality that we have. You know, you need people movers. But if you have got lots of people who are going in many directions, then the smaller direct responsive transport, so transit or DRT or even autonomous models might be better solutions. Yeah, if we're talking about a smaller city, a 250,000 city, then I always argue with my concession holders here in Amsterdam about why they are not experimenting more with these kinds of flexible services. It just makes logical sense that they should be doing more experimentation around these kinds of different kinds of models and etc. But they don't. It's a sort of mentality that says we have been managing fixed line public transport for the last 80, 90 years, and this is what we do it well, we're not going to do anything else. But even in the most basic things, like putting shared electric bicycles, even at the top 10 most popular tram stops or metro stops that people can use, would already be a great start. To think about what kinds of services that they can create to allow people to do the last miles of their journey would already be a great start. Yeah, I'm biased, of course, but I still think bicycles, of course, is the easiest and simplest way to start this ball rolling.
All right.
Maybe I'll continue, because I just want to emphasize the last point. If you talk to not all, but a lot of the mobility service providers, they say we need some scale we need a big city to make it happen, to make it work, and at the end to make it profitable. But looking at smaller cities and mid-scale cities, that's actually not the case, right? The city itself can establish a very successful multi-model mobility environment within the city. It doesn't have to be the multi-million metropolitan area to make this happen. It can happen in a smaller scale, and it can happen very successfully. And I think a lot of smaller cities or smaller areas tend to kind of get demoralized by the statement of the large global players who say, well, this is not big enough for us. And these are two different angles for the same question. I think answering this or tackling this question from your individual angle is very promising, right? And I think the second aspect is, as I just mentioned, intermodality can have just huge potential if done right. Right? You don't want to cannibalize, as Eduardo said, the most efficient, most sustainable mode that's already out there. So there needs to be some sort of concept and orchestration and active orchestration. You can't just as we've seen with when bike sharing swept over Europe, right? There were large global players, predominantly coming from China, who just, without any regulations in the metropolitan areas, were able to dump thousands of bikes in a certain area. And these services, they don't distinguish themselves by the best bikes. They don't distinguish themselves by the lowest price, because the price is already rather low. They just distinguish themselves by the amount of bikes available, or the amount of service available. So there needs to be some regulation in order not to overflow the city, especially a city with 250,000 of people in it, to make sure that this all falls in line of a greater mobility concept and ensures that we have a multimodal concept that actually works.
I add just one very small thing to that, very small, because at the moment what we see in Amsterdam, and that happened to us, by the way, we had the Chinese that came over and dumped 3,500 bicycles, and we said, no, get rid of it. But what we see in Amsterdam is that we have more and more of these shared mobility operators who are putting their services and products into play, and that's all fine. But if you ask me where I think we're going to in the future, is that I do think that there needs to be part of the public transport concession holders' concessions that actually put these kinds of shared modalities and these extra additional services into the concessions themselves. The KPIs have changed now, and it's not just about, time and cleanliness. It's time also that the public transport providers themselves are also responsible for delivering some of these additional services.
Yeah, I think that's a very good closing remark here. It is integration that needs to happen. No mobility service can basically exist without the other. It is basically the synergies, 1 + 1 adds up to 3 at the end of the day. And I think that for a city like Cork, there would be the huge potential, not only for autonomous vehicles. We have large housing estates on the outskirts where the cities aren't that narrow, where you would have space, where you would have quiet streets to actually connect late night services, late evening services into a more kind of doorstep delivery, doorstep set down service. So we hope that maybe in the next couple of years, something from the Shannon testbed will also see the light of day and hit the road really in real life in Cork. And in the meantime, we have a very successful public bike sharing service here in Cork, the most successful of Ireland outside of Dublin. So we hope we can build further on that, bring it further to people, bring bikes actually to the people. So here I just think of the transformed petrol station that you've shown, Eduardo, that we bit by bit expose the drivers where you can get them to the option of why not changing over to the bicycle, and that it's getting more and more accepted. And at the second step as well, on parallel, teaching the younger generation. There was just a comment here from the audience. What if more kids were actually felt safe cycling to school, and not only the kids, but first and foremost the parents, as needs to be said, need to feel comfortable with the kids cycling to school. You would take so many car trips off the road, and then in return, it would help to make public transport more reliable, and it would break the vicious circle. So I think we are in a big transformation process here in Cork at the moment. Bus Connects, as we have it here, can't do the job alone. Neither can bike sharing alone. Neither can the Luas, the light rail line, do it alone. It is about the mix. It is about the interaction between classic public transport, demand-driven, demand-responsive, flexible routing, mini transit shuttles, whatever you name them. Things from Russell's Shannon testbed, hopefully in a few years' time. And so basically getting the mix right, getting it all together, I think that is the future to go. So in that sense, our time is almost up. I thank you everybody for your presentations, Russell, Eduardo, Andreas, and thanks for the discussion, for the questions in the chat. So before I hand back to Connor for the closing remarks, thanks to Shannon, danke wel to Amsterdam, and schönen Dank, schönen Nachmittag nach Frankfurt. Thank you. Bye-bye. Tot ziens. Tschüss.
Okay, great. Stefan, thank you very, very much. And what a really, really interesting set of presentations and discussion. So look, thank you very much, Andreas, Eduardo, and Russell. And Stefan, super job in terms of facilitation. And I had my own little sum up done there, but you've actually expressed that far better than I could ever in your own closing remarks there. So really well said. And I suppose, look, there is opportunity in the context of Cork, I think, in terms of its scale and looking at combining that consumer demand with the supply that's there, the multimodal supply, and then maybe trying to align policy with around that as well. So I think it's there, the opportunity is there to be grabbed, I think, this particular point in time. So really, really interesting, and I think a lot of scope for further discussion and further debate across the various fora that many of us are involved in. So really, really good. Again, thanks to Gas Networks Ireland, Matheson, and Cork Chamber Skillnet for your support. And keep an eye out as well, everybody, for our next event in this series, soon to be announced, around energy, finding opportunity in crisis. No, that's an interesting. That's going to be an interesting one, as you can all imagine. So, and that's set for the 14th of October, 11 a.m. And as always, keep an eye on corkchamber.ie for all of our various events and activities, be they in person or like today online. So I think that's pretty much it. Thank all of you for taking the time to be with us. Thanks to my own colleagues for super job in putting all this together, particularly Margaret and Vicky. And I think with that, we'll sign off. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a great weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.